I'm going to be talking in the same kind of vein, I guess, as both those talks, but I want to try and focus around the work that I and my colleagues have been doing for the last 13, 15 years on taking the sentiments of refocusing or rebalancing the curriculum in the direction of the development of valuable habits of mind or character education, but to try and look in the reality of schools at how you bring precision and implementation and transition to those kinds of things. And it's not easy. A lot of the work that we've been doing has been looking at the kinds of the way in which these ideas have changed in the way that they're phrased, and the kind of implementations which seem to be successful in drawing the idea of developing valuable life skills into the centre of what goes on in schools. Not to just leave them at the level of fine words and good intentions, and there's plenty of that around, and not to diminish them by treating them merely as skills which can be trained, treating them as thinking skills where we can have separate lessons and train kids in, we now have our very course that we're very proud of in Year 7 called Learning to Learn, where we've managed to find 2 weeks out of the busy curriculum. But unfortunately, the rest of their time has changed very little. The fine words live in the school prospectus, and they may live in certain short, sharp additions or appendages to the curriculum, but the work that we've been doing is what do these intentions, if they don't carry through into the mainstream of the curriculum, if you can't feel a school's commitment to the development of empathy, collaboration, inquisitiveness, reflection, self-regulation, independence, if you can't feel that, if you can't taste it in the 17th minute of an otherwise ordinary lesson on the Tudors or simultaneous equations, then you haven't done the job, I don't think. If we haven't worked these intentions back into the moment-by-moment lived experience of youngsters in school. So a lot of the work that, as I say, that I and my colleagues have been doing over the last little while has been to kind of say, to explore in mainstream schools, what does that look like? What is the elbow room or the leeway for a busy teacher, not just in a private school with all the advantages of numbers and pre-existing habits of acceptance and understanding the rules of debate and so on, in a whole range of different kinds of schools. What does it look like if you're going to make progress in this dimension? I'm going to kind of introduce my perspective relatively quickly because it sounds as if, I'm afraid I wasn't able to be here this morning, it sounds as if the general tenor and focus of the day has been very much in the directions that I would want to explore. Let me just introduce my perspective as a very brief kind of loosening up, and you'll have been thinking and talking about many of these things today. If you look at that list of things and ask yourself, are there a few of those skills or habits of mind, whatever we might call them, attitudes, which leap out at you at an intuitive level as being things that you think young people would benefit from possessing in order to flourish, to use Felicia's word, in the world of the 21st century as we know it? Which ones leap out at you? 30 seconds with your neighbour. Well, we could argue about these things for quite a long time. There's a lot of leeway for disagreement, but I'm going to take a gamble that you are, like most other audiences that I talk to regularly, that you will tend to pick out more of the green things than the other things. People say when you ask them, as parents, as mums and dads, as much as educators, the things that would come at the top of your list, not that the others are irrelevant or worthless, but the things that would come at the top of your list are things to do with, as we've heard many times already this afternoon, collaboration, inquisitiveness, independence, reflection, self-organisation, and so on. Let me show you the same list again and ask you, in the traditional good school, which of those skills and habits do we require of youngsters most of the time? You'll get a very different answer. You'll mostly get the red things. And I think probably one of the reasons why we're here gathered together, like most of the schools, if you're like most of the schools that I work with, is you're very interested in how to move from the red side to the green side, how to make progress, if you like, in moving from, if you want to put it rather caustically, a 12-year, very expensive apprenticeship in developing the mindset of a 19th century clerk, diligent, punctual, legible, accurate, trustworthy, deferential, and so on, the traditional habits of the school curriculum, towards what you might call those habits that we've been talking about this afternoon, which you might characterize as the mindset of the 21st century explorer. Not that this is an either or, not that the things on the red side are completely useless, just that if you look at the job section of the, I forget what the Cambridge local paper is called, Evening Post or something or other, Cambridge News, look at the job section of the Cambridge News, you will find relatively few job adverts which say applicants must be able to copy down neatly, sit still, and show deference. It's like they're not at the top of most people's lists of life skills. So the perspective that I'm exploring is not how can we add on something, how can we not supplement the traditional curriculum with a co-curriculum, or with a debating society, or with Outward Bound, or with lots of other things added on round the edges, but how can we shift our core methodologies, shift the milieu and the culture of classrooms, so that we are cultivating a broad and appropriate range of things which we think will stand youngsters in good stead in the 21st century. One of the things that I have realised, and you will probably realise this quicker than me, is that however you construct a lesson in a school, you are always addressing learning at all of these levels, at all of these layers. There is content, there is knowledge, there are things that you can express and talk about, there are skills of reading and digesting and manipulating and calculating and analysing, but there are also, slightly below the line or below the surface, a cumulative development of dispositions towards learning, of attitudes, values and interests, and of even identities as a learner. People who grow up with a certain sense of what their place is as knowers, their place as makers of knowledge or critics of knowledge. And there are lots of youngsters, not perhaps in the majority of the schools represented here this afternoon, but lots of youngsters who come out of school having learned very powerfully that they're crap at learning. One of the most important things that they learned in school is that they have little place in the game of creating, manipulating, and evaluating knowledge. They learn that they're not good at it. And that's inadequate. There are other people, many of them who go on to universities like Oxford and Cambridge, who've come out with a very narrow set of learning skills which have enabled them, with a lot of help from their well-meaning teachers, to garner a clutch of A's at their A-levels, which have got them to their high-status universities. But the 15% of them, approximately, who will find their way as undergraduates at Cambridge to the student counselling service, many of them will be there because they are now encountering learning which is more demanding than they've ever met before, with a very significant lower level of support than they've ever had before, and they have not been helped to develop the resourcefulness and the resilience to cope yet they have developed a self-image which says, I am and therefore ought to be bright and successful, and they therefore find themselves, as Felicia I'm sure would agree, in an emotional pickle which says, I am now no longer the bright, articulate, happy, successful person that I'm supposed to be, and I don't know how to cope with that, I don't know what to do with that. So it's very important. One of the things when I'm working particularly across a whole range of different schools, from the independent sector through to struggling state schools, is to encourage people to understand that this agenda that we're exploring this afternoon is of equal applicability, equal validity to the bright girls at the first school as well as to students in very different kinds of schools as they're progressing. We can't not, let me illustrate how we can't not, with two caricature lessons. Well, you can decide whether they're caricatures or not. We're in a year 8 class, and yet again they're doing the tutors. The kids as they go through school tend to get the tutors about 3 times, and every time they get it, their teacher assumes that they've learned nothing worth learning before. So it tends to reappear. So here are 2 lessons on the tutors. My point is not that one's a good one and the other's a bad one. My point is to invite you to think about what skills of learning are being required in this lesson. How are students being positioned in terms of their job as learners? And is there even a conception, is there a kind of practical epistemology, a conception of knowledge that is underpinning the nature of that lesson? Lesson 1. Students walk in, sit down, open their exercise books, and know without even being told that their job is to transcribe as quickly and as accurately as they can the notes that have been projected on the whiteboard into their own books. When they finish that, they have to read a prescribed chunk of the textbook, and at the end of the lesson they're given a multiple choice questionnaire to establish their level of factual comprehension. Lesson 1. What skills of knowledge, what positioning as a learner, what conception of knowledge underpins that lesson? I'll get you to have a nap with your neighbour after I've told you lesson 2. Here is lesson 2. The students walk in and their teacher has written rather cryptically on the board, history is the story written by the winners. Napoleon Bonaparte. They then have a vigorous classroom discussion about the extent to which historical records, historical documents are necessarily partial, biased, perspectival, never a wholly trustworthy or true or comprehensive record of events, always subject to being contested, to being supplemented by other positions. They're then set to read a few pages of their textbook together in pairs, and their task is to unearth the unstated assumptions behind the way those few pages have been written. In other words, to do a bit of critical literacy on them. I've seen low ability classes engage enthusiastically with that activity. It's not something only for bright kids. In other words, what opinions are being passed off as facts? What evidence claims are being made without justification and so on? And they're critiquing the textbook from that point of view. And at the end of that lesson, they're asked to do a bit of writing about an event that they've been studying in the Tudor period through the eyes of 3 different protagonists. As it might be that you're writing as if you were Elizabeth I, and then as if you were Mary Queen of Scots, and then as if you were Lord Burleigh, the Lord Chancellor. What skills of learning, what job as a learner, what conception of knowledge are at play in that lesson? Quick answer with your neighbour. Contrast the two. It's not. My point is not that one of those is a dull, boring, and traditional lesson which would at best be given an Ofsted good, and the other is imaginative and just good teaching. My point is that wittingly or unwittingly, those teachers are simultaneously, at the same time as they're doing the tutors, they are also doing the acknowledgement, the legitimation, the cultivation, the strengthening of certain learning skills, the positioning of students, imagine that cumulatively over 10 or 12 years, as people who are either passive supplicants at the fountain of knowledge, or people who are apprentice makers, critics, evaluators of knowledge, and so on. As I said, this doesn't matter. This isn't just about being a bright sixth former. This is something that any students in school can be engaged in. So in one lesson, you might say they're practicing the skills of transcription, of accepting what you're being told, of reinforcing an idea that proper learning is done on your own, is done solo, and that the goal of it is to be able to regurgitate in a relatively undigested form information which you've been given, or to apply certain highly prescribed forms of manipulation to the knowledge which you've been given. In the other lesson, the students are practicing discussing, collaborating, the skills of being able to stretch your capacity to try and imagine what it would be like to be someone who lived in a very different time, or maybe even as a different gender from yourself, and to adopt an attitude of critical skepticism towards what you're being told. In a seminar, the workshop that I was running a little while ago, I found myself at coffee time talking to a group of secondary school history teachers, and they started to bemoan the fact that their students today were worryingly uncritical when they went on the internet. They read stuff on the internet and they somehow thought it was true. And I said to them, slightly mischievously, but they were willing to take it, I said, could you just reassure me that the way you're doing the causes of the First World War with your students is designed to cultivate that attitude of skeptical appraisal of knowledge claims that you're now complaining they don't have? And they went a little quiet, those teachers, but because they hadn't really seen that the causes of the First World War was, amongst other things, an exercise machine for developing a useful life attitude or a life skill. They hadn't joined up the dots, that the way they were teaching, their pedagogical form, was actually not neutral with respect to the worry that they were quite rightly talking about. Now, the question about these variations of pedagogy, I'm not talking about what we should teach, I'm talking about how we should teach what we teach, and what kind of epistemic apprenticeship. I am a professor, so I'm allowed one fancy phrase. An epistemic apprenticeship is it. What kind of epistemic apprenticeship, knowingly or unknowingly, are we putting youngsters through? How stereotyped is it? How modern is it? How variegated is it? How functional is it for preparing youngsters not only, as my friend Art Costa says, not only for a life of tests, but for the tests of life? And the not only is really important, because we need to ask two questions about those two lessons. One, which is going to help them get their GCSEs or their A-levels best, and which is going to, at the same time, prepare them better with the skills, the green-sided skills that most people in the most surveys that I'm aware of would agree are the things which help kids to function well in the 21st century. Well, the answer is fairly obvious. The second of my two lessons scores better on both those criteria. Right? Not just on the second criteria, but on the first criterion as well. And there's a lot of research to show that the more we engage students' sympathies and interests by teaching in a way that transparently and visibly also contributes to preparing them to deal well with complexities that they will meet after school, both intellectual complexities but also emotional and personal complexities, the better they do on the tests. And one of the things that has bedeviled this argument up to now, I think it was Helen who talked about the Punch and Judy show, is the predominant assumption which blocked progress in this area, that somehow or other, as a hard-pressed teacher, I'm forced to choose. If I'm under pressure from a local authority or from Ofsted or from a Secretary of State for Education to deliver results based on the retention and the recapitulation and the limited manipulation of content, sadly that means I'm being forced back into a 19th century model of teaching and learning. And part of my campaign, if you like, is to say, no, you're not. You're not forced back. That's not the choice that is being given to you. You can deliver those results in a way that also simultaneously helps youngsters use the curriculum as a way of developing the learning dispositions which get them better for life. Now, we know that these ideas are not new ideas. We know that they're well endorsed, particularly by high-status individuals within academia, which is important. We know that the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University back in 1942 said the test of successful education is not the number of A's you got at A-level, but whether we have helped you protect and strengthen your appetite to know and your capacity to learn. Those are more fundamental. Those are the below-the-line benefits, the valued residues. Was it Churchill, I can't remember, who said, education is what's left after you've forgotten everything you were taught at school? And it's those residues which are the most vital and the most important. Seymour Papert, co-founder of one of the two founders of one of the most creative and prolific labs, the MIT Robotics Lab in the planet. The skills you can learn when you're at school will mostly be obsolete by the time you get into the workplace, except one. The only skill that you can guarantee is not going to go out of date, has no sell-by date, is the skill of making the right response to situations for which you have not been specifically prepared. You may remember an outcry which got reported in the press a few months ago by students from good schools who were carefully prepared by their teachers for their Oxbridge interviews and were then flummoxed by being asked questions by clever dons which they'd not been prepared for. And these students were angry and distressed by this experience. They were cross with their teachers for not having pre-prepared them in order to be able to meet these things. But that's life, isn't it? It's like, do you think that your job has been well done if you produce students who can deliver 4 A's at A-level, but who don't know how to think on their feet and hate it when they're asked to? The contemporary answer, most of the contemporary answer, would be no. David Perkins, Helen's already referred to, one of my gurus in this area. I can hardly think of anything more worth learning than learning to learn. It's like money in the bank at compound interest. It's like, what's not to like about helping youngsters fit the turbocharger to their learning capacity? They will obviously go further, faster, and more economically in their learning journeys if they have those capacities to benefit from them. We know that there's widespread, endemic global dissatisfaction with the above-the-line preoccupation of skills, knowledge, and understanding. This from a large report commissioned by edXL 3 or 4 years ago. 2,500 people in focus groups around the planet in 73 different countries being asked questions about the fitness of education as a preparation for employment. And Ross Hall, the director of International at edXL, had a road to Damascus experience when he got the results in. The ubiquity of the response from Korea and Finland and Israel and China and Brazil and Paraguay and Panama and Canada and Wales about people saying it's not good enough. We must pay closer attention to the not just the rhetoric, not just at the level of fine words and good intentions, but to the systematic and precise cultivation of the qualities which everybody knows are needed in the workforce. Even Singapore, Michael Gove's most favourite country to quote because they do well in the PISA tables, the Singapore that he quotes is the Singapore of 10 years ago, not the Singapore of 2013. The Singapore of 2013 is one which has become deeply worried about the fact that they perfected an education system which enables 3-year-olds reliably to give you the correct answer to a sum like what is 3/4 of 2.4. And 93% of 3-year-olds in Singapore can deliver the right answer to that kind of question. No, they can't. I made that up. But you know, it's that kind of thing which impresses some people around the planet. But then they took a deep breath and half a step back and said, but we've produced calculating robots who don't know how to think for themselves, who have no initiative, who have no creativity. So their national curriculum is now built around below-the-line prescriptions, not above-the-line prescriptions. Those kind of sentiments, one of the things that we discovered in an evaluative research project of a group of schools that have been doing their best to imbue their curriculum with these values, to take seriously the question, so what does this mean then for me as a teacher of acids and bases, or religious festivals, or football, or whatever? How am I being asked to be different in the way I go about doing my job, inviting children into particular ways of transacting the knowledge or the skill that is my particular part of the bailiwick? One of the things that we discovered is most powerful is a school taking those ideas, those sentiments, taking them on the mat with their students, with all the staff of the school, with the non-teaching staff of the school, with the parents, and wrestling them around until they have something that feels right for them, as the Perse has done, as Helen was showing us. Not just parroting the IB, not just the IB learner profile, not just parroting the Building Learning Power list of 17 learning dispositions, but actually saying, what is a language, what is a recipe, what is a list that has meaning and potency for us? What are the right words to describe these qualities for our children? And if schools don't do that, then it's very often that these things simply live at the level of lip service. So one of the things that we discovered was the investment by the leadership team of the school in building that sometimes difficult, sometimes fractious conversation about what's at the heart of what we're doing, as this chair of governors who was interviewed by our researcher said off the top of his head. What sits at the heart of what we're offering the children in our primary school is a confidence and a capacity to deal well with uncertainty, to adopt multiple perspectives, to work with different kinds of people, to ask good questions. These were not parroted, these were things that were actually in the bone marrow of the school, which informed almost everything about the way reporting was done in the school, the way lessons were designed, the way teachers planned and worked together, the way parents were communicated with, the way parents were engaged in the activities of the school, and so on. If there isn't that process of working these things into the daily language and the constant mindfulness of people who work in the school, then it's very easy for them, like the seed that fell on stony ground, to flare up and fizzle out without really making a lasting difference to the youngsters. A lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to uncover small, low-risk, but cumulatively highly effective, highly leveraging, to use that horrible word, shifts that any teacher could make in a classroom to begin to focus with greater precision and greater deliberateness on the cultivation of the kinds of qualities which we've agreed we value. And on most people's list will be the green-sided things on my early list. Inquisitiveness, children valuing their own questions. Well, how do we do that? It's very easy to do the opposite. It's very easy to construct a school environment within which children's own questions are very clearly not valued because they're never invited, they're never dealt with. But it's very easy, once you identify that, to flip that over in a little rural primary school and greet the children on Monday morning, not by saying, what did you do over the weekend, but who's got a good question for us to put on our questioning wall? Who's really got a really nutty problem that we can all help them think about? And you'll have a big wonder wall in that classroom, festooned with post-its that are visual, living representations of the children's inquisitiveness. We don't have to answer them all, we don't have to be omniscient, but we create an environment that bristles with the children's, literally bristles, with the children's own curiosity when they come into school. We could, if we want, reward the children on a Friday afternoon, or at the end of the day, someone who's been particularly good in the classroom, by saying, and now we're going to have 5 minutes to help Kieran puzzle about his favourite question. What question would you like us to help you puzzle about, Kieran? And just finding time to remind the children that their curiosity is as valuable as anybody else's. Building collaboration, building an awareness and a sense of sophistication about managing the social side of learning for yourself. All of us in this room have a relatively well-developed degree of sophistication about when to go for a walk, when to sleep on it, when to talk to an old friend, when to have a meeting with well-informed peers about something. We know how to move around in the social space of learning. So here are some little examples. Again, you can judge whether they're primary or secondary school. Some of them will be obvious. Here's I'll tell you, this is a year 3 class in a primary school where the children have been told an activity that they're going to be doing by the teacher, and then she says to them, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which it is, in this school and in this classroom. But before you embark on the activity, I'd like you just to get into a huddle for a minute with your learning buddy, and I want you to come up to tell me at the end of the minute, what do you think will be the best group size to do that activity? So these 7-year-olds get together and they chat, and some of them think 2s, and they can offer their reasons. But the majority of them in this lesson that I sat in said they thought 3s would be a good size. Okay, get into 3s and off you go. Adding a small, low-risk wrinkle to a lesson which addresses, but in a small way, but potentially cumulatively, children's ability to manage, to be thoughtful about, to be articulate about, and to take responsibility for one small aspect of their own learning. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with building learning power in the young footballers in the Premier League footballing academies. I'm on my way to a place called St George's Park, where I will be tonight, to work with the coaches of what they call the foundation stage, the 8 to 11-year-olds there. And tomorrow we will have a demonstration from a squad of young players from Sunderland Football Club who, and I know what they will show, their coach will tee them up, these 10-year-olds, a group of about 15 10-year-olds, will tee them up to practice something or other in front of us on the indoor pitch at St George's, and then we'll stand back and we'll watch, and what we'll see is that they will do what they were told for a while, and then they will stop and very quickly have a quick check-in with each other as to whether this is now becoming too easy, and if so, how can we make it a bit harder for ourselves? How could we rack up the level of difficulty so that we're getting a productive level of stretch? And those youngsters have been coached so that they are now perfectly capable of being their own coaches, of designing their own coaching regime. How many of you design lessons in that way? So that something is left open in the lesson for the students to contribute to the design of. It's perfectly possible once you articulate it. It's not rocket science, and parents are not going to, chaos is not going to break out, parents are not going to march on the school saying, you're jeopardizing my daughter's prospects of getting to keyboard to read PPE or whatever it is. They're small, low risk, but relatively high leverage adjustments or tweaks which cumulatively add up to growing confidence and capacity and appetite for managing, organising and evaluating learning for yourself, so that when you find yourself at Clare reading medicine, you don't end up in the consulting room of Mark Phippen, the director of the counselling service. Here, you're not one of those students, you're one of the ones who knows what to do when they don't know what to do, which was Jean Piaget's definition of intelligence, you may remember. Knowing what to do when you don't know what to do is something that we can perfectly well blend into the day-to-day cultures of classrooms, and at the same time find that our students are getting better and better results. So there are a whole lot of these. This is just a representation of some of the visual tools that we use. This is a poster that students make about the thing. It's called a stuck poster, things you could do when you get stuck, so that you're not helpless. And the students continually keep contributing to and developing that knowledge, so that the classroom becomes a workshop for developing craft knowledge about how to make yourself a more independent learner. And that poster could come from a year 3, or it could come from a year 12 classroom. It could be a bright group of A-level physics students, or it could be a reception class, I don't care. You can begin to work on those ideas at almost any level. This is something that one of our teachers devised a little while ago. It's called the riskometer. This is in a primary school. Children are given some latitude about how difficult to make an activity for themselves, like those young footballers, and then they can indicate the level of risk that they've chosen for themselves by putting their picture on things like a thermometer, by indicating visually. Now that's appropriate for a group of 6-year-olds. It may not work with a very bright group of 17-year-old physics students, but you might be able to find another way of engaging the same kind of process, the same kind of thing as you're going along. And I won't bother to talk about all those kind of things. It's just like there are lots of things which are going on in your schools, but the question is, how joined up are they? How articulate are they? How systematic are they? How precise is your specification? How well do you know the school? from the point of view of the protracted mental exercise regime which your students are getting? How articulate are you about what that epistemic apprenticeship looks like and how it changes year by year? How do you know that your year 10s are indeed more imaginative and resilient than they were in year 9? What are your indicators? What are your benchmarkers? How are you knowing that progress is being made? What does resilience mean to a bright 17-year-old, which it couldn't have meant to the same student when they were 11? These are the kinds of questions that we need to be grappling with if we're going to build powerful cultures that develop these sides of what's going on. This is a report published by a group of students from a group of schools in South London, where they interviewed a lot of people about learning and created their own report. This is produced by a group of 11 to 14-year-olds. This is a new curriculum at Cheadle Hulme, which I got the other day, which is built around extended project work. And this is an education research journal produced by the staff of a large school in Gosport. Let me just pause. An education research journal produced by the staff of the school in Gosport, because they read a very well-known book by a man called John Hattie. John Hattie said, the biggest effects on students' levels of achievement occur when two things happen: when teachers become learners about their own teaching, and when students become their own teachers. Those two shifts in a school culture are mirror images of each other. When teachers become more enthusiastic imaginers, experimenters and collaborators about the process of teaching and learning, the results go up. And particularly when the focus or the objective of their experimentations is to hand over control for teaching and learning to the students. I'm already over time, so I won't show you all the data, the nice data, which shows how levels of achievement improve in schools that are pursuing these kinds of approaches. This is a range of some high-achieving schools that show increased GCSE results when you devote effort to helping the students become more resilient and resourceful. These are some comments from Ofsted inspection reports who don't yet know what they're looking for, but they love it when they see it. They love it when they meet students who are like the students in Helen's videos, who are articulate, sophisticated, have a rich conception of learning and of themselves as learners. And as I say, there is lots of evidence to show that students who have a rich conception of learning and of themselves as learners do better on the tests. But I'll leave you with just a couple of comments, which is really the bottom line. What's the effect on the students? I don't have video, but I have a couple of written reports. This is Tom, who's just moved to a boys' grammar school in the home counties from his old school, talking about how he responds to teaching and learning in the school. In my old school, their really rather coarse notion of progression was just to give you harder and harder worksheets. That was as good as it got. But he says, but here in his new school, they really stretch you to learn in different ways. That's really interesting. To learn in different ways. You get lots of encouragement, so you learn to keep going and dig deep when things get difficult. That school was very worried that they were getting extremely high levels of examination passes and extremely high levels of docility, passivity, and instrumental attitude towards learning. And they've now made a really substantial shift to that, which is what Tom is talking about here. Now I always like to see if I can take things one step further. But I'll leave you with Danisha, who's only 6. She's at a first school in Harrow, and she's talking about why she goes to school and what the point is. She says, if something's hard, you don't want to just say, oh, this is hard, I'll just skip it. You try, because the best thing is, if you don't try, what's the point? Because when you grow up, you might come to some answer you'll still not know, and you can't skip it then. So Danisha understands that the below-the-line valued residues of school are much more important than whether she can name correctly the colours of the rainbow. Thank you very much.